I feel like everyone has that game they think they missed out on. Something you saw talked about in magazines or sitting on a store shelf that sounded intriguing at the time, but that you never played for whatever reason. Time passes, other games come out, and that mystery game fades into obscurity and you never end up playing it. The thought of it still comes to mind every now and then, though, a pang of regret that you missed a hidden gem you could have enjoyed if only you had made the effort to pick it up. Damnation was that game for me. I'm a sucker for a good alt history narrative, and dumb, steampunk motorcycle action sounded like something I could get into. I remember reading a preview in an old Game Informer and thinking, Gears of Civil War, that could be cool. And then when it launched, I saw it on the shelf at my local Blockbuster and thought, I'm gonna have to rent that as soon as I'm done with Infamous, or Resi 5, or whatever other more notable game stole my attention in early 2009. Then of course it reviewed poorly. Very poorly. Which put a damper on any motivation I had to grab it close to launch, and I moved on. What with me doing these videos now, I decided to take my chance and finally play Damnation. And let me give you some advice. Fuck that pang of regret. Fuck that fear of missing out. Sometimes games fade from your mind and die for a reason. Sometimes, dead is better. And with that, let's just hop right into this hot mess of a game. Normally, I like to break down lore first, especially with an alternate history setting like this, but there's nothing to break down. The following is quite literally all we get in terms of setup.
Two armies battled until blood ran as rivers, and both forces fell to dust. From the lawless chaos, a new power arose and spread across the land, leading us all into damnation.
After that, we cut to a silly-looking Civil War ninja slicing some dudes up, before our team rolls in on steampunk motorcycles, caps some bowler hats, and starts talking about serum. Our gang is composed of the protagonist and former soldier, Rourke, of the Coalition Army, whoever they were, indistinctly Native American healer and midriff enthusiast, Jikikin, and Professor Winslow, who's leading our resistance movement, which, by the by, seems to literally just be the three of us. Who exactly are we resisting, you might ask, because that intro was completely useless? Well, the opposing force in this case would be the PSI, an evil corporation led by a man named Prescott, who basically acts like Snidely Whiplash's shittier younger brother. Anyways, Rourke and the crew are here to... Actually, it's totally unclear why they're here. It's implied later that it's to help stop the invasion of this city, Arrow Tree. Though what the fuck they actually think they're going to be able to do here between just the three of them is unclear, as there's no pronounced plan. What we're really here to do is take a lovely stroll through some already ruined buildings, get Rourke's rote backstory about his missing fiancée, Dayton, and get a handle on the game's controls. So on that note, let's talk about the gameplay. Your time in Damnation is largely broken down between gunplay and platforming, though there's not really much interplay between them. This isn't Doom Eternal or anything like that. Really, the only truly shared element is that they both feel absolutely terrible. To start off with the combat, as it's what you'll probably spend the most time with, things are kind of a mess. At a glance, it might seem like a stock standard late-odds cover shooter, but then you realize there isn't actually any way to take cover. Despite a preponderance of walls and chest-high ledges, all you can do is fruitlessly rub against them. At best, you can manually crouch or poke in and out from behind bits of the environment, but even that isn't as simple as it sounds due to a particular quirk of Damnation's controls. You see, that severe platforming and gunplay split I mentioned earlier even finds its way onto the mouse, thanks to what Damnation calls combat mode. Basically, to do anything related to your gun, you need to hold the right mouse button first to enter combat mode, and then to do anything movement related, you need to let go of it. This means no reloading guns on the run, no crouching or standing up while aiming down sights, and no hip firing or blind firing whatsoever. Thanks to this tedious separation of legs and trigger finger, every encounter ends up clunking along rather awkwardly. This pacing is further hindered by the fact that most of the guns in this game have more spread than a jar of Smuckers, including the bread and butter assault rifle you'll be using for most of the game. Sniper rifles and pistols are better but have less ammo and much shallower aim respectively. There is a zoom mode that tightens the spread and makes every gun much more accurate, though still far below what you would want. However, the game never even mentions its existence. You have to go into the options to find the keybind for it, and it's just labeled zoom. So naturally you'd be forgiven for thinking it's only for weapons with scopes. You know, the ones that could feasibly zoom. Of course, I didn't work this out until about halfway through the campaign. I'm Not always the quickest on these things, but then I discovered zoom mode has a core drawback as well. It's an extra step. Every time you see an enemy, you need to stop, enter combat mode, enter zoom mode, adjust your aim, and then fire. Which, thanks to the animation present in each step of that process, there's a second or two delay between when you see an enemy and when you start engaging with them. Now add that to each time you exit and then re-enter combat mode to duck behind cover, or reposition, or reload, or whatever, and you start to understand my frustration. There are other bizarre design decisions attached to the combat as well, like the ungodly sea of bloom it uses to show whenever you've been damaged, or the fact that it decided instead of regular grenades, this game needed to have trip mines that act like Duke Nukem-style pipe bombs, so you'll never use them as trip mines. But really, those other issues pale in comparison to just bogged down and unpleasant core shooting experience. There aren't even any saving graces in the arsenal to brighten your day, as every single gun in this game handles terribly and just isn't fun to shoot. The auto-jib super sniper rifle has its moments, but is finicky and unintuitive. The railroad spike pistol seems OP until you see the awful reticle and realize it has no ammo. And the rocket launcher that should be part of your standard loadout fires this thin, easy to miss with projectile in a very shallow arc that's weirdly hard to judge. Even the base pistols and the assault rifle all feel awful, lacking recoil, having piss poor accuracy, even when zoomed, and lacking much real impact. Ugh, I'm sick of talking about the combat though, so let's continue on with the rest of the first act and move on with the story. As we get to the end of our tour of all this ruined masonry, we find one Ramon Seferius Zagato, the only one who showed up after we, apparently, requested reinforcements from the neighboring nation of Terra Verte. He's also the only one left fighting this battle, defending the main bridge into the city, a completely pointless endeavor when you consider all of the enemy troops we slaughtered directly behind him, and while he's trying to stop PSI's advance forward. We lend him a hand with the defense, while the professor sets up some explosives and blows up the bridge. Naturally, PSI has a fucking bridge-making truck with them, because I guess they were expecting this, so we have to swiftly beat a retreat. At the last moment, Rourke's terminal "ma-wife" syndrome activates, and he stops to go to try to find Dayton, as she was maybe supposed to be here, I guess. Regardless, this delays the crew long enough for these Civil War ninja from earlier to come and capture the professor, setting up our goal for the next act. Rourke, Yakikin, and Zagato then escape and regroup, by which I mean pointlessly bicker, before we then go visit Yakikin's overly cryptic stereotype brother Akahando, who uses his vague Native American magic to tell us where the professor is and drive the plot forward. Cut to us Indiana Jonesing across a dubiously accurate map of the United States on our way to Boomtown, the creatively named mining city where Professor Winslow is being held. We have to make our way through said mines before navigating the larger Boomtown Canyon City in order to get to him. Before we head into the tunnels though, we get a short political squabble that's done entirely in reverse shot close-ups, like this is the Phantom fucking Menace or something.
So, Rourke, how many men did the Coalition lose in Boomtown?
Zagato, I have forgotten. Where did you serve during the war?
Terra Verte has a long and noble history of neutrality.
Neutrality. The last bastion of cowards.
Terra Verte has no cowards.
So get moving, Zagato.
You're lucky. I'll be busy when we reach the ground.
I'd say that little tete-a-tete is the perfect example of how Damnation tends to handle dialogue, but then this following exchange happens not 15 minutes later, wherein Zagato and Yakikin exchange quips/threats at each other, while idle animating not a foot apart in a random room.
Yakikin,
What is it now?
you handle yourself well. I mean, for a healer and a woman.
Pray we are never on opposite sides.
I was merely trying to compliment.
Then your aim is poor, both with your words and your guns.
Be thankful I have not aimed them at you, yet. You are a hard woman.
Pain and death are hard.
Put simply, the dialogue is bad. It's real bad, and it never gets better, so let's not dwell on it as the crew makes their way through the mines. Really, the only thing of consequence that happens in this section anyways is the tutorial for the special spirit vision power that Akahando granted us all before we left. What this does is allow Rourke to focus his ki, or whatever, and activate detective mode. highlighting enemies through walls so we can find threats and plan a route. You can also revive allies from a distance while doing this, which is good because the companion AI is dense as a black hole and will end up dead pretty often. That said, I rarely use this mode because it's just not all that necessary. The bad AI translates to the enemies too, so they rarely go to much effort to hide or misdirect. And frankly, it's often quicker to just kill the fuckers and end the fight rather than revive your allies. Outside of this mystical meandering, the mines also contain some prime examples of this game's favorite thing. Unnecessarily large areas, littered with platforming elements, and a sparse handful of oddly spread out enemies. And speaking of platforming, this is probably as good a time as any to cover that second pillar of Damnation's gameplay. While parkour was a tacked on bullet point for many games in the 7th gen, for better or worse, it truly was a core part of Damnation. Even in the days of the original mod, we'll get to that, it was being pitched as Call of Duty meets Prince of Persia, and that followed through to this full retail version. However, the Prince's PS2 adventures aren't the best comparison for how the movement feels in this game. A better analog would be the OG Tomb Raider back on the PS1, because much like with pointy polygonal Lara, controlling Rourke's more complex movements feels very involved. In order to do things like jump from ledge to ledge, climb up ladders, swing on poles, and other assorted acrobatics, you need to employ very rigid sequences of the spacebar, C key, and left shift in order to tediously complete each step of the maneuver. The game is also very persnickety about the difference between running and sprinting and what that means for certain kinds of movement. What all this means is that you need to approach the platforming with a degree of patience and forethought, which works well for the few larger climbing sections, but combined with the whole combat mode thing, kills any chance of blending the greater movement into the combat. This wouldn't be the end of the world if those larger climbing sections I mentioned were engaging or interesting in any way, but they're really not. Most of the time, the path forward is very clear, with things being so rigid and safe that there's little chance of failure, and the boxy, dull buildings, scaffolding, and ledges you traverse just aren't satisfying to navigate. It makes every one of these sections feel more tedious than anything, and while they can serve as a nice break in between firefights, more often than not these sections, and the platforming as a whole, just feel like boring, washed-out steampunk filler. Speaking of filler, let's cut the fluff and get back to the smoldering dumpster fire that this game calls a plot. We continue on through the mines with Yukikin and Zagato bickering here and there, and picking up details along the way about that mysterious serum from earlier, which Prescott has apparently been dosing his soldiers with. Applied properly, the stuff increases strength and vigor, but gives someone too much and they're driven completely mad, with the tainted water supply being why every miner we run into has been a crazed murderer. Between that and the serum's sickly green glow, it's basically the Re-Animator juice from, well, Re-Animator, but injected into living beings.
Later.
80s horror movie references aside though, we push into the Boomtown Canyon proper, briefly ride a very terrible motorcycle, and then take a gondola across the river so we can free Professor Winslow. On the way, we're shot at by snipers while the enemy commander, Selena, and her companion in the stuffy jacket, do serum behind the bleachers after class in an attempt to seem menacing. The two of them have Winslow trapped in some sort of open-air prison, guarded by a couple big fuck-off turrets. Thankfully, PSI decided that this highly secure, incredibly important holding facility was the perfect place to keep several hundred explosive barrels. Just sitting out in the back parking lot. Naturally, we blow those up, which destroys the building, frees the professor, and leaves the stuffy coat lady pinned under a massive iron door while Selena gleefully escapes. As she does, we're treated to a quick cutaway where we see Akahando has wandered shirtless into the icy wastes for some reason, only to get captured by PSI and brought back to Prescott, who seeks to use his stereotype powers for evil. Back at the prison, Yukikin goes to finish off Coat Lady, but Winslow stops her because it turns out she's his daughter, Jack. As such, Rourke and Zagato lift the door off of her at his behest, and then, for some reason, I'm saying that a lot in this video, it's decided that we might as well destroy the whole mining complex while we're here, because, shits and giggles. There's some hand-waving about it disrupting PSI's operation or something, but ultimately this is just padding in service of getting an additional disappointing kaboom out of these assets. We do some more platforming and some more shooting, before eventually sealing off the smokestacks, which is somehow enough to cause this entire place to immediately erupt. Rourke and Zagato escape at the last minute, thankfully, and the team gets a chance to regroup on their airship. Jack and Winslow catch up while he fits her with a fancy new robot arm and a revealing top with armored spaghetti straps, which just seems silly, frankly. She then provides the team with some inside dirt on Prescott's plans, though outside of Winslow, they all remain suspicious of her intentions. Regardless, they take her info at face value and head off to stop PSI from invading Terra Verte by destroying their artillery, which is stationed nearby in Mesa Dorado. As the team nears the mesa and prepares to drop using these silly steampunk glider things that seemingly have zero protection, Jack slips away and gets ahead of them. Still being suspicious of her intentions, Rourke and Zagato give chase on their own gliders and naturally get shot down almost immediately. It's fine though, as they pretty much forget about Jack and get on with the mission of destroying all that artillery in what is one of the most tortured and annoying set pieces in this game. Figuring out how to get onto these guns is not the most intuitive thing in the world, especially with enemies hounding you from all sides, and of course destroying the thing you're standing on with a big fuck-off rock comes with its own foibles.
Get clear! It's coming down!
I didn't talk about how we got here, though, because it's honestly a good bit from where we crash landed, and the answer is what it always seems to be when this game needs to chuck in some padding. Motorcycles. Damnation loves its motorcycles. Sadly, I don't love its motorcycles. These sections aren't necessarily bad, mind you, there's not enough to them to feel genuinely awful, but they are terribly dull and unsatisfying. A lot of this falls to the physics of these things and how they control. The bikes just feel way too slow, especially for the size of the engines, while at the same time being very unwieldy and unpleasant to handle. If there is any sort of challenge to these sections, that all might be a problem, but by and large, each of these is a straight shot forward with a few jumps and some hilariously jank wall riding strewn throughout. You will somewhat occasionally run into enemies while riding, but you can't actually shoot them while on your bike, nor is it even worth engaging with them because they can't catch or hit you while you're at full speed. Even in the few sections where you're expected to deal with some enemies before moving on, you can just run them down with little trouble and they'll ragdoll aside. That is, assuming the bike's crazy physics don't meet up with the piss-poor world geometry and send you flying. There is one other thing that bugs me about these bikes, though. You see, the big trike model you ride sometimes has a massive jet engine at its center, despite those not being put into conventional use until the 1920s. Now, I fully understand that in Damnation's world of robots, super soldier serum, and straight-up literal magic, this is an extremely petty complaint. But it's indicative of a much larger issue that honestly ruins Damnation for me as a whole, and that's the complete and utter misuse of its alternate history setting. The kernel of an interesting idea at the heart of Damnation is that of a civil war that never ended. There's some actual meat on those bones. Seeing how that fight would impact westward expansion, what the ongoing conflict would do to technological development as the new century rolls in, and how the people of the day, both everyday folk and famous figures, would react in the face of it, are all interesting thoughts. Put very simply, what would make this story work, and what makes all alternate history stories work to some degree, is taking the events, people, and elements we're familiar with from a particular time, and looking at them through a lens of what if. While Damnation generally maintains a stoic seriousness and pretends as though it wants to ask those pressing questions, it instead relegates anything that is historically familiar or realistic to that brief, not even 30-second montage at the very start of the game, and then just throws all of that in the garbage in favor of its own convoluted lore. It's why we don't go to Atlanta, Denver, Arizona, or San Jose, but instead to their non-union equivalents, Aerotree, Boomtown, Mesa Dorado, and Terra Verte. Cities you might have actually heard of, such as New York and Philly, are relegated to posters and side elements. There is also no mention of figures who were famous during the Civil War, nor of those from 30 to 40 years later when this game takes place, depriving us of guaranteed to be hokey, but at least thematically appropriate meetings with President Lincoln or Roosevelt. Hell, as mentioned, Rourke isn't even a former Confederate or Union soldier. He fought for the Coalition and versus the Federalists, two new factions that rose up out of the actual historical ones for no real purpose beyond obfuscation and making this game's world that much more obtuse. And then there's all that fucking super tech and magic I mentioned. Those sorts of elements need to be very carefully woven in and explained in an alternate history setting in order for the story to still work. Even in a more fantastical take on a historical time period, you need to show the progression of how things went from the timeline we know to this new reality, and to make things still feel internally consistent with the general logic of the setting. Now, I don't mean you need to plot out every single scientific detail of how your stupid plot twist fits into the laws of physics, but simply how the tech and people of the era could, even very loosely, make everything work. BioShock is a fantastic example of doing this in a video game. Plasmids are, for all intents and purposes, magic powers after all, but they go deep enough into the idea of Adam being stem cells grabbed from sea cucumbers, and it all essentially just being gene therapy to convince your brain to give it a pass. The same goes for all the advanced technology in that game, as it has that distinct clunking, whirring soundscape and an electromechanical vacuum tube aesthetic that makes it feel believable when you're told it's from the brightest minds of the 1940s who have been secreted away and had any and all legal and ethical limitations on what they're allowed to do stripped. Damnation, on the other hand, just throws these sorts of elements in with no regard for how they would come about, how they should work, or how they would impact the setting, past, present, and future. After all, you'd think if the indigenous people of North America could all perfectly predict coming events, see through walls, and heal any and all wounds with but a touch, including reviving fallen comrades by just looking at them like we do in spirit mode, then the colonization of the continent would have gone a little differently, almost certainly precluding the American Civil War as we know it from ever occurring in the first place, therefore making this game's whole plot moot. I'm not even going to get into the whole killer robot army thing and how dumb that is, beyond pointing out that the game calls them Automen, which is so charmingly silly I can't help but smile, as it makes them sound like Transformers. Alright, I got off on a tangent there, and I feel like I'm about to pop a blood vessel thinking about this stuff, so let's get back to the story and just move this mess along. After destroying the guns, Rourke and Zagato decide to continue onwards instead of calling the airship, for really no real reason beyond that Rourke has a hunch that something more is going on here. He's right, naturally. PSI has been poisoning the water here too, all under the command of Selena and her weird ninja we saw back at the start of the game. In fact, as we get to the opening into Mesa Dorado, we see the ninja running forward ahead of us, so we give chase. This takes us through the city, which is situated around a giant golden statue that's just sitting in the middle of this massive cenote, all while fighting off fevered locals and Prescott's dog soldiers? Dog soldiers. Okay. Dog soldiers along the way. Nothing of note actually happens in Mesa Dorado, of course, despite it being one of the more visually interesting locations in the game. Instead, we quickly pass through it so we can get to a generic cave, where we're ambushed by Selena, who's in some sort of Dr. Eggman turret contraption. We also run into Jack here, who is on our side as it turns out. She was just a red hair, and she helps us deal with Selena, who we leave dead and buried in the cave. Selena's not done yet though, because as we leave, the game cuts away to her ninja friend walking up and healing her in the exact same way we saw Yukikin doing earlier. We also get another poorly set up aside showing Prescott turning Akahando into a human slide projector so we can take his sweet, sweet secrets. There's no time for sledgehammer subtle foreshadowing though. We have to make our way down to the canyon floor so we can stop PSI's new super train, Juggernaut, from attacking Terra Verte. But all this slow-ass platforming means we miss it by just a hair, with Selena and her ninja mocking us as they speed by on their motorcycle like Dick Dastardly and his dog Muttley. With the team torn between chasing the train and chasing Selena, Rourke and Zagato waste time pointing guns at each other and then split up, with Zagato going off to aid the defense of his homeland, and Rourke and Jack joining the Wacky Racers and heading off after Selena. Fuck all really happens during most of Act 4, so perhaps it's fitting that it's called Interlude. Rourke and Jack tool around on a motorcycle for a bit, before delving through some sewers, all while Jack argues at Rourke for extended periods of time. You see, outside of cutscenes, Rourke never talks, so your companions just end up having conversations with themselves, often very defensive ones for some reason, such as this odd bit of palaver.
I guess you still have your doubts about me. Rourke, have you never been deceived? Love and hate are powerful emotions, often at the same time. You think of me as a petulant child. I am a woman, a scientist, and a soldier. Do not underestimate me. Zagato is wrong. I did not betray my father. I did what I had to do in a world gone mad.
I'd like to think Rourke is in his head just quietly humming to himself during every single one of these exchanges, completely oblivious to his partners pouring their hearts out to him.
Rourke, have you never been deceived?
You have my
Love and hate are
undivided
powerful
attention.
Emotions, often at the same time. You think of me as a petulant child. I am a woman, a scientist, and a soldier. Do not.
With so little to talk about plot-wise in this chapter, and frankly being dead sick of talking about the mechanical and narrative substance of this leaking trash bag disguised as a video game, let's all take an interlude of our own with the fabulous and amazing cavalcade of Damnation jank! Refreshing. So yeah, this game is not exactly an airtight technical marvel. I will give credit where it's due. It never crashed, and it worked with no fuss on modern hardware outside of a few strange intermittent loads, so, that's something. Gold star. But as you can well see, the minute-to-minute experience is played with bad AI, animation glitches, fuzzy geometry, and a less than subtle use of ragdoll. Honestly though, these were some of the most enjoyable moments of the game, simply for how blatantly ridiculous they are and for being a break from the tedium. On that note, back to the tedium and the rest of Act 4. Climbing out of the sewers, we come face to face with Selena and her ninja, who it turns out is not just some faceless goon, but is instead the mutilated corpse of Rourke's lost fiancé, Dayton. She's been mind-controlled, I guess, though none of her actions up to this point, including those against Rourke when Selena hasn't been around, have seemed forced or robotic in any way. Her true form is at least a cool design, so points for effort there. Selena orders Daytonstein to kill Rourke and Jack so she can fuck off and go do villain things in Terra Verde. What follows is a taut and desperate fight, full of heart-wrenching emotion as Rourke must slay the love of his life. We leave this tender, heartfelt moment to quickly cut away to what's going on in Terra Verde. It seems in the 5 minutes we spent gunning down Dayton, Selena has not only managed to teleport to the front line, but caught up with the Juggernaut, rallied her troops, and has since invaded and conquered the city. We cut back to Jack and Rourke, who apparently got over killing his long-lost love real fucking quick, who see the devastation from the cliff top and head off to go help what little defense remains. We can see something else from this particular vantage point, though, and that's the fact that Terra Verte is apparently made of Lego. Now is probably a good time to talk about Damnation's general level of quality when it comes to the presentation. I'm not going to go too in-depth here, you've already seen plenty of the game at this point, and the jank montage did a fantastic job of showing the relative amount of care that went into this title. Now, that's not to say I think everything about this game looks bad, just extremely inconsistent. A lot of the guns are decently well modeled and textured and have unique profiles that admittedly are kind of lost from a third-person perspective. I also don't necessarily hate the character design, which I know is quite the thing to say considering that Damnation is probably best known at this point for Yakiken's underboob. But for as silly and thirsty as those designs can be, they did manage to sneak in a lot of little details that do feel like they add something to these extremely thin characters, like the fanciful leatherwork patches on Zagato's shirt, for example. They also feel largely consistent to the world, outside of Selena and her alligator skin coat. She looks like a rejected Tekken character, but everyone else fits well enough. And that's all the praise I have for this game's presentation. The rest ranges from terrible to mediocre. The environments are all extremely dull and boxy. Despite each location being theoretically distinct, every building seems to be made out of harsh right angles, adorned with whatever material is appropriate, and laid out in ways that are completely non-functional outside of being parkour obstacle courses. Defining a course through them isn't helped by the muted color palette. It feels like it flattens everything down into an unintelligible mess. Then there's the animations, which are often so poorly thought out as to be laughable. Things like this bizarre, gravity-defying pull-up animation, and the fact that your revolver's hammer seems to have a mind of its own. What's even worse is that Damnation never tries to hide any of this with its framing. Despite coming from a company that has made actual commercially released feature films, we'll get to that as well, the cinematography is largely god-awful. I've already shown an example of the game's egregious use of shot-reverse shot, with close-ups that are just too close up. I suppose I haven't talked about the sound design of this game at all, not that there's really much to say. The music is entirely unmemorable and poorly used at that, especially during the oddly quiet motorcycle sequences. In fact, the action in general is largely left without much score to prop it up, going instead for more of a soundscape sort of feel, which doesn't really fit the rest of the game at all. The SFX are also a joke, as not only are the guns limp and unsatisfying, but there's a dire lack of crashing and explosion sound effects in this game to punctuate any of the set pieces it desperately tries to foist upon you.
Perfect.
And of course there's also the stiff, almost so bad as good voice acting, but I think we've heard quite enough of that by now. In that same spirit of moving things along, let's get back to Jack and Rourke and their efforts to help save Terra Verte. Leaving the cliffside, they hop onto a motorcycle and ride along the top of the city wall, before lying their way past the front gate, though what that guard thinks he's even doing here I don't know, considering the city has already been overrun. After a quick jaunt across the rooftops and through the streets, we make our way to the home of Zagato's father, the imposing Terra Verte governor's mansion. Naturally, the governor's not exactly rolling out the red carpet with all these invaders, so after a quick and pointless turret sequence, we scale the building and burst into his office where his bed inadvertently opened fire on us. He's in panic mode because Terra Verte has remained neutral throughout the course of the vast American conflict, and believes that they should remain that way, and that they haven't been betrayed by the PSI at all, despite being invaded. He also takes a moment here to disavow his son, all before more PSI ninjas, apparently Dayton wasn't the only one, crash in through the roof and gun him and his men down. Thankfully for Rourke and Jack, though, Zagato comes flying in on one of those gliders from earlier and slams into the firing line, saving the day, but sadly not his papa. It seems the governor whispered some dramatic final words to Rourke, though, telling him to tell Zagato to take up the fight and lead the city's remaining forces. He also mentioned something about a super-secret defense system, so we slip through a hidden back exit and go tromping through the sewers to find it before surfacing at the back of the city. It's here we have our final showdown with Selena, who really does seem to get around rather impressively. She's taken up a sniping position on a ledge with the Insta-Jib gun, hurling pitiful insults and dreadfully powerful rounds at us. Thankfully, her AI is no better than anyone else's in this game, so counter-sniping her is easy enough. We somehow then teleport inside another building, presumably the one with the big Not Poseidon statue out front, and after a tedious platforming puzzle, the defense mechanism activates, opening up the levees surrounding the coast and flooding the city. Rourke and Jack then call the airship and fly off, with one last glimpse back to see Zagato leading his troops onward, left with the prize of a city that's now a good few fathoms underwater. Despite the fact we're now a man down as we've left Zagato behind, the crew seems convinced that the next step in our plan should be to assault Prescott's base directly. The professor has a modicum of sense and argues against it, but Yukikin has a vision of all the shit that's been going on during Akahando's little sleepover at PSI HQ, so caution gets thrown to the wind. To get there, we hop on the super train as it heads up north, somehow managing to stay hidden during the trip to PSI City despite the journey taking us from Southern California all the way up to what looks like northern BC. Also yes, Prescott named his capital city PSI City. The creativity in this game abounds. Jumping off the train early so we can take the offensive, Yukikin and Rourke truck onwards to the front gates, but find them locked and surprisingly poorly guarded. We instead then duck into some sewage pipes which are positively dripping with serum and slowly wind our way up through the underworks of the city as we make our way to Prescott's tower. So I'm coming back to this during editing, which is why my audio sounds different there you go. And there's actually a whole segment here about the politics of Damnation and kind of what it feels like it was going for. I ended up cutting it because it didn't quite feel fair and like I was interpreting a little too much, but I do want to address it just so it doesn't feel like I'm completely ignoring that aspect of the game. Specifically, there are these propaganda broadcasts you hear throughout the entire game. It's here where they kind of come to a head, and it seems like maybe they're poking fun at the Bush administration, which would have been in power during the time of the game's development, and all that kind of stuff. And then they also start talking about, well, briefly glancing at Damnation's darker themes here. You run into the kennels where they're keeping the dogmen, and you run into the laboratory where Dayton was turned into Daytonstein, the Civil War ninja monster thing, and it's kind of revealed that all the rest of the ones we saw there, all those Civil War ninjas are Yukikin's sisters. But none of this stuff really matters, because it's all very poorly told. That scene where Yukikin comes upon the lab where all her sisters have been mutilated isn't a cutscene. She just stands there idle animating while pouring her heart out. And as a result, it doesn't really have any bearing on anything. It never really comes up again. But yeah, I wanted to touch on it really quickly in this super slapdash commentary, just to make clear that I wasn't forgetting it in case there's a Damnation superfan out there. Doubtful, but you never know who might find this video, so there you go. Back to your regularly scheduled broadcast. After finally weaving our way through the city proper, we end up at the front gates of PSI Tower, where we blow open the doors before meeting up briefly with Jack and the Professor, who've been off doing something. They're going to create a distraction for us while Yukikin and Rourke head up the hollow tower to face off with Prescott. Why is the tower hollow? I have no idea. It's even remarked upon by Yukikin, so it was clearly an intentional design choice. I'm guessing it's supposed to be further ham-handed political metaphor, but there's no time to consider it as we push through a few more goons and break down the door to Prescott's office. We then save Akahando under the cover of lots of Dutch angles and shaky cam, as Prescott injects himself with a big boy syringe full of serum and runs off. Giving chase, we get to the designated boss arena where he shows up in a mech suit, making the whole prior syringe thing seem unnecessary. Akahando then shows up on the balcony so he can use the fancy new holes in his head to project walkthroughs ripped from YouTube onto the clouds in order to guide us through what is already honestly a very straightforward fight. A couple phases of that, and then the serum finally kicks in and we get to fight Prescott mano a mano. And it's exactly as exciting and as intense as you'd expect. And that's that. Yakikin and Rourke look grimly upon Prescott's corpse as PSI City explodes in the background, before we cut to a contextless shot of their airship, all while Akahando says some vague nonsense about freedom that in no way relates to the actual plot. So that was Damnation, at least the version that Codemasters released in 2009. But that's not the whole story. Before we get into my final thoughts on this hot mess of a game, let's take a look back into where it came from. Because after doing a little digging, I found some very curious layers to the development, promotion, and history of this particular title. First off, let's consider the developer of this game, Blue Omega Entertainment. Have you ever heard of them? If you're thinking about video games, then probably not, and that's because their commercial releases prior to Damnation were movies. Specifically a slasher flick called Dark Ride and a thriller called Danica, the later of which notably featured Marissa Tomei. Neither of these films are especially well rated, either publicly or critically, though to be fair, I haven't seen either picture nor do I plan to. But that does give a view as to where the studio was coming from and where their prior experience laid. Very much past tense on that, by the way, as naturally they shut down not long after Damnation's release. On the publisher side of things, we're looking at Codemasters during a particularly interesting part of their history. Not content with their decidedly double-A and more often than not racing-focused output, in the late aughts they started swinging harder with varied, bigger titles meant to compete in the AAA space. Their slate during this time, though, was a mixed bag, including the ambitious post-apocalyptic open-world racer Fuel, beloved Sauron role-playing simulator Overlord, and other less acclaimed titles, like Rise of the Argonauts, Clive Barker's Jericho, and Turning Point, Fall of Liberty. They were very clearly scrambling for a big, transformative hit, and they were hoping Damnation could be it. For what it's worth, they did also throw some marketing muscle at it. In addition to a few different previews I saw referenced, there was also a contest for a specially made steampunk PC to celebrate the game's impending release. And of course, they went real highbrow by securing the most prestigious piece of promotional material you can get for your game. Nudie shots in Playboy's annual Girls of Gaming feature. But why were Codemasters so confident in this effort from a sophomore developer with only movies to their name anyways? Well, that's because Damnation was not technically Blue Omega's first game. At least not the Damnation we just tore apart. You see, the very first thing Blue Omega ever released was Damnation, the Unreal Tournament 2004 mod. That version of Damnation was entered into Make Something Unreal 2004, and ended up taking second place in the final round, only losing out to the original version of Red Orchestra, developed by the team who would go on to become Tripwire Interactive. Now, that creates an image of underdog bedroom programmers, scrapping together a build to try to win some prize money and more importantly a license to develop on Unreal so they can become a real studio all their own. But then how is it they went on to make movies instead of games? Well, that's where the story gets interesting, but also where I'm going to start being a little vague. It turns out that Blue Omega was a subsidiary of a web tech company, which had made a good chunk of change during the dot-com era and was looking to expand out into media in general. The two companies shared a CEO, and they were the core creative mind behind both versions of Damnation, with their name plastered all over the credits. Apparently, he had a dream and wanted to turn it into reality. And I'm guessing he saw the Make Something Unreal contest as a way to market test that dream and with any luck cushion the cost of development. Midway through that contest, he hires some freelance developers to come in and put it all together. I actually found a blog post from one of those freelance developers in which they describe their experience working on the mod, which to Blue Omega's credit is quite positive. But it does also shed some light on the rather mercenary corporate style approach that Blue Omega seems to have had towards game development. This is further backed up by a GamesIndustry.biz feature that came out during the development of the retail version of Damnation, where the studio pointed to the more subcontracted style of production found in modern cinema as a model that the games industry should adopt. Now, ironically, they then shut down almost exactly a year later, while embroiled in a messy legal situation, with companies they had subcontracted to work on Damnation, as well as their publisher. But that's all neither here nor there. The point I'm trying to get across is that despite Damnation seemingly being a passion project, it was developed in a way that's about as far from the typical image of underdogs, starry-eyed modders as you can get. So with that being the case, I had to go and see what the deal was with this mod for myself.
A nation will rise against itself. there will be famine, disease, murder, and devastation. From the ruins of hell, we shall rise up against the tools of our enemies.
Right off the bat, you can tell that Damnation 2004 has a very different tone than 2009. It's going full mid-2000s edge on things, which makes sense when you consider that Prince of Persia Warrior Within came out this same year. In addition to that fantastic butt rock in the intro, that razor-sharp tone means 2004 has an actual color palette to it, and is full of saturated, over-the-top character. The enemies are more lively, they talk a lot more, both to each other and by yelling at you, and their designs are more interesting, looking like blood-soaked, crazed Civil War soldiers rather than bargain bin grunts and bowler hats. Our main cast also has a lot more verve to the way they look, sporting more stylized costumes. Yakikin's new, or I guess old, loincloth thong is certainly a look, but at least she's no longer decked out in boring earth tones and a schoolmarm haircut. It's also worth noting that you can even play as the other characters in this version, rather than just being stuck as Rourke, though they don't seem to play any differently, so it's just a matter of whose ass you want to stare at. Still, it's an idea at least, and it's something they could and should have expanded on more in the full game. As for fundamental mechanical differences between Damnation 2004 and 2009, the two versions remain surprisingly close-knit in design. That split between combat and platforming is still there, but more distinct in 2004. Hitting tab will switch you back and forth between third and first person, with all the platforming happening in the former and the combat in the latter. It's basically the same as 2009's combat mode, but the switch in perspective, despite being a little clunky, feels more natural and intuitive. It also lets them lean on Unreal's existing solid FPS controls and mechanics to make the combat feel semi-decent, though Damnation's predilection for terrible accuracy seems to have started here, and the enemies are a little too bullet spongy to boot. These things don't make the game hard necessarily, the AI is still not great, but it does mean the gunplay isn't quite as satisfying as it could be. The mystical elements also return and are more interesting here, but also not quite as well set up. There's a whole system of spiritual energy and lives and healing totems, but I never quite managed to figure it out, and I never saw a tutorial prompt for it either. I was able to muddle through regardless though, thanks to quick saves. Spirit mode also returns, but instead of just highlighting enemies, it also allows you to take over an enemy and use them to complete puzzles or ambush their comrades. It's a slow process and doesn't seem like it could be used effectively in combat, but like with the multiple characters, it's a really neat idea they could have expanded upon in interesting ways. That's basically the deal with this whole mod, honestly. It's a bunch of really cool ideas that should have made for very fertile ground for a full-scale game. And it's surprising how much of it, the tone aside, made it into the 2009 version. But ultimately that's also the issue. Very little was actually changed and iterated upon in any significant way over those 5 years. Damnation 2009 is largely just the ideas present in this mod, but filled out and altered slightly by the inclusion of modern, for 2009, trends and gameplay mechanics. Things like the regenerating health and the whole game being washed out and unpleasant. None of what was added in the full game feels like an evolution of the unique ideas that are present in this mod, and in some cases they're a step back, like the incredibly generic arsenal you're given in 2009 compared to the mod's arrow rifle and steam thrower / sniper rifle. For what it's worth, I can see why Damnation 2004 took second place in that contest and was generally quite well received by the community. In the context of it being a first-time effort put together quite quickly, and of it being a free piece of content rather than a full-priced game, what's on display here is quite impressive for the era, and I did manage to have some fun with it. It's janky for sure, and getting it running was a real pain in the ass, but admittedly that's on UT 2004 and how it works with Windows 10. Regardless, there is a fun experience present here, and I get why now that Codemasters would pick this up, and why people would be excited about an expanded version of this mod. That was apparently all wishful thinking though, as what we got in the end was the 2009 version of Damnation that we suffered through in this video. Why it ended up like that is incredibly hard to say. Between the fractured development style, the lawsuits I mentioned earlier, the 2008 recession, and just the way that shooter trends of the day ended up conflicting with some of the ideas and positive points that were present in the original mod. Bottom line though, is that the end result is not good. Damnation looks ugly, even for the time, it's got a ton of rough edges and bugs, and worst of all, it's just not fun to play. Perhaps the multiplayer was a little better, though the reviews I can find don't give that impression, and either way, even if people did like playing this steaming pile with others, they're not doing it now, and for good reason. To return back to my original point from all the way back at the start of the video, Damnation is not a hidden gem you should feel bad for missing. It was best left on the shelf back in 2009, and it has not aged gracefully since then. It failed miserably at launch, killed its developer, and even the company that ported it to PC. The only lesson there was to be learned from digging it up is that some things are best left in the ground. I know. At the end of my last video, I said I'd have this one done soon, and clearly that did not happen. Things kind of spiraled out of control once I started digging into what the fuck this game's deal was. Not to mention that at a certain point, I had to step away from the project for days at a time because, frankly, there's nothing more depressing than focusing all of your free time on a game as utterly soul-sucking as Damnation. As for what's next at this point, I'm not really sure actually. I have a few different games in mind, but I haven't settled on which one will be next. I'm also trying to refine and optimize my production method to get these videos flowing a bit more smoothly. But obviously, I'm not going to make any promises on that front. After all, this is just a hobby for me, so I'm trying not to take this all too seriously and instead just have fun with it. Regardless though, hopefully this particular descent into Unreal Engine 3 caked madness was worth the wait, and as always, I hope you all have a good one. See you next time.